Papel Podcast, the #1 place for everything Pangyas. And now your host, Michael Pierce.
Hello everybody, welcome back to Papel Podcast. My name is Michael, and today on From Art to Model, we're going to do something a little bit different. A few days ago on Twitter, one of my 3D modelers that I follow actually uploaded their model of a Tamagotchi, which, if you guys don't know, a Tamagotchi used to be like these retro 90s kind of virtual pet toys that were very popular amongst kids, and I had one myself as well. Now, I always like the look of Tamagotchis because I think they have just interesting geometry, the kind of simple shapes, but they have a really nice aesthetic to it. Now, the person I follow on Twitter, which is Isabel at Ozidinum, I think I'm saying that right, I could be wrong. Apologies if I did. They decided to upload their Tamagotchi model, the blank version of it, for people to download and edit and kind of give their interpretation of what they might want to use it for. So, of course, for me, I want to use it for something based on Pangyas. Now, for those of you who might be watching from Twitter and don't know what Pangyas is, it's basically a golf game that's like anime style. It's a Korean golf game that came out in 2004. It's been running for over 15 years now. And it has one of these characters in it, which is this little dolphin that's called Dolfini. And he's like this really weird, adorable ball dolphin, and he just kind of like follows you around, chases your ball, and you know, helps you out in the game. But he's one of the more iconic characters in the game, and because of his sphere shape, he's definitely used on a lot of merchandise. So I thought, why not see what I can come up with this base model, work off it, and kind of make it into a Dolfini themed Tamagotchi. So without further ado, let's go from art to model. Okay, so here we are modeling again. Now what I did to start off is, I didn't record this bit, but basically I imported the original model from the Twitter user, and it was a very low poly model, which was intended for the art style. But for something that I was going for is something a bit more realistic, a bit more high poly, so I just basically tried to retopologize it. I used a lot of different smoothing algorithms, like Turbo Smooth, for example, to give it a nice, good, high poly shape. But the core base is still there, apart from a few little tweaks. And I do eventually remove the chain, which you'll see later on. Now, the Tamagotchi itself has a very egg shape, which is very fitting because that's more or less the shape of Dolfini himself. So I made a texture in GIMP that was pretty much Dolfini's face. I overlaid it with the model and made sure that the proportions were right, so then the eyes go between like either side of the screen, the mouth goes across in the middle, and you know, everything's split into the white and blue. And then I saw this little antenna thing for the Tamagotchi, the AR or IR receiver. It kind of looked like something that was very thin, very tall, and what does Dolfini have that's very thin and tall? He has his umbrella. So I actually textured that in the color scheme of his umbrella, which is the like light blue pole, and then the umbrella itself has the patterns of yellow and white. So I think that was really nice to add like that little extra bit. I quickly went into GIMP and made a pixel version of Dolfini. Now, the pixels aren't actually 100% perfect. Some pixels are much smaller than the other ones, but overall it's pretty, you know, it's pretty consistently stylized. And while on a technical level it might not be correct, I think it turned out pretty well. And what I'm doing here in 3ds Max is just kind of using a spline to trace over the pixels, get it as, you know, good as possible that I can, and try to make it into more of a 3D model, so then it has a really cool 3D effect. Now what I'm going to do with this Dolfini model is actually make it pop sort of both in and out of the screen. It's going to kind of hover somewhere in between. It's slightly on an angle on all axes, and I tried to make it interestingly 3D without like crazily popping out or anything like that. Now the screen I actually pushed in a lot further than the original model. It was already kind of indented in the original model from Twitter, but I made it a much deeper screen so that it has a bit more of a bigger effect in terms of 3D. And what I've basically done with these base textures is just kind of do the basic outline of it. The screen, I wanted to have this kind of interesting scan line effect. So now that the model itself is done and the base textures are there, I bring all of this into Substance Painter. I bake all the textures and make sure everything is looking good, and then I start to go into detailing everything. So it's nothing, super complex here. I start by doing some subtle, linings and basic seam work for the lines of the textures, so then kind of has more indents, more 3D looks to it. And as a reference, I always switch back and forth on my computer to look at real Tamagotchis, real photos of Tamagotchis to see kind of how they're made up. There's a lot of seams on the sides, the back, and kind of halfway through, so I lined those seams up with where the textures were for Dolfini's face and tried to make it as best as I could. Then all I'm doing here is simply throwing over a bunch of procedurals and kind of tweaking it as a base and making sure it looks good, and then afterwards going in and perfecting it, painting where I want it to be, removing and masking out things that maybe don't suit the model as well, and making things more specific to where the textures are in 3D space. I made the screen itself very reflective and a little bit metallic, so then it had a more interesting 3D effect. And then here I just basically give the pixel art for Dolfini a much darker color, so then it really stands out against that green screen background. I also made sure that the Tamagotchi itself was quite reflective, quite shiny, had a lot of subtle bumps and scars, so then it was, visibly used and had some wear and tear to it. But I also made sure that the buttons on it, the 3 buttons at the bottom, were very rubberized and very matte looking, so then it was that unique distinction between the two materials. There was some occlusion dusting that I did that made, just textures blend in together much better. Here I'm doing some more outlining, but more specifically for the mouth and the eyes. I felt like compared to the rest of the textures, they just weren't popping as much. And again, if I looked at real-life Tamagotchis, there were a lot of them that had very specific details that did kind of pop out and were embedded or, popped out of the plastic itself. So I wanted to make sure that those type of details came through in this Dolfini figure. And then finally, what I wanted to do for the final touch is I went into GIMP. I made up these little Pangya Korean logos. You can see it's a Korean Pangya logo. And I basically just stuck them on where I thought they would be. I did all the copyright information at the back and battery safety information as well. Sadly in the final render you obviously don't see the back, but you'll see the front, and it looks really good and it came out really well. Now what I did for the final render is I do this a lot with my rendering, is I will render the exact same shot about 5 times in different lighting situations, different exposures, making sure that anything that I get that has a really nice highlight, especially for reflections for example, I make sure I turn that exposure very high up, so then later on when I compose it all together, layer everything on top of each other and adjust all of the levels in GIMP, I can kind of pick and choose what light comes out, what darkness and shadows bleed in, and kind of perfect what rendering I want for the final composition. I think it's really good to have those options and to kind of adjust and tweak them to what you want, rather than just being restricted to what you have in the one shot in engine, or it's going to be rendered anyway, so you may as well kind of have many options and be able to tweak between them. So I think that's a really good tip if you guys ever want to use that. But the final render looked really great. A lot of people who saw it, a few of my friends and my boyfriend actually said it looked really realistic, so I'm very happy with the final render. Isabel, I want to thank you again for the base model. It was really fun to use and kind of see how you made that. Of course, everybody should follow them on Twitter and follow their work. It's amazing and I'm a big fan. So, well done. If you enjoyed this work, feel free to follow us and support us on Patreon below. Any little bit definitely helps.